In a shocking turn of events, Joni and Doug just told everyone in Israel something that made them speechless. Jonathan and Suzy were shocked and couldn't hide it. They had no idea what was going to happen. The news shook their beliefs to their core, leaving them with questions that no one saw coming. What did Doug and Joni just show? What will it mean for the group in every way? The news they gave you will blow your mind. Joni and Doug's trip to Israel was supposed to be peaceful and spiritual, but it quickly turned into something much deeper than anyone could have expected. They planned their trip so that they could visit the holy sites, interact with the locals, and learn about the areas long past. Everything looked fine from the outside. People smiled, shook hands, and wrote about Joni and Doug as they walked through the streets of Israel to promote their ministry and share messages of hope. But while the cameras caught their public moments, something much more important was going on thousands of miles away. The Western Wall, which is in the middle of Jerusalem, is one of the holiest and most respected places in the world. Rose Howard has known the Lambs for a long time and is a family friend. She wasn't at any public event or big church tour. She was just there to pray. Rose was doing what many people had done before her, standing in front of the old wall, giving God her whole heart, leaving a written prayer, and asking for help. Rose did something small, but very strong in that quiet moment, when there were no crowds or noise. There were two people she cared about very much on the list, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb. She wrote their names on the paper and slid it into a crack in the wall. Not a single light or camera was there. It was a private act of faith. Outside of the noise of public events, it was a quiet act that meant a lot in the spiritual world. Suzy was going about her day in Montana when she got a picture message from Rose. It was just a picture of the Western Wall, with some words next to it. But Suzy felt a wave of emotion. Their names were written on the same wall where she and Jonathan had prayed many years before. Tucked away in a crack, surrounded by other people's prayers. For Suzy, it wasn't just a nice thing a friend did. It was a holy sign that God had not forgotten about them. What I heard was like a whisper from heaven, a message that was clearer than any words I could say. This wasn't just a nice thing to do. It was a message from God that linked their past, present, and what God had planned for their future. Their names were mentioned again in a place with a lot of history, and where prayers have been said for hundreds of years. God was telling them that He saw them, loved them, and still had plans for them. The discovery happened quietly, so no one else really noticed. It was also not like anything else that had happened before. As Suzy sat still in her Montana home, her phone rang. It was Rose calling. It was a picture of the Western Wall in Jerusalem, a holy spot where people from all over the world come to pray, give requests, and connect with God. The picture wasn't strange by itself. After all, Rose had gone to Israel for personal reasons, to have time to think and pray. Suzy wasn't interested in the picture itself, but in what was on the wall behind it. There was a small piece of folded paper carefully tucked into one of the cracks in the old stone. It was an easy thing to do. Still, it felt like the most important act of faith at that time. Rose wrote their names on the wall, Suzy and Jonathan Lamb. In one of the holiest places on earth, there was only one person praying for another. There were no cameras, reporters, or other people in the public eye. This small and private event was kept secret from everyone except God. But to Suzy, it was like a divine echo, a word from heaven that said, "I haven't forgotten you." Suzy felt her heart start to race as she looked at the picture. It wasn't enough for someone to pray for them. That wasn't it. Their names were being put on the same wall where they had stood years before as a young couple full of hope and excitement about their future. It was the weight of the moment. For them, as for many others, the Western Wall was a place of prayer where they would pour out their thoughts to God and ask for help and blessing. After many years, Jonathan and Suzy were not where they had been. A painful turn in their mission journey caught them off guard, and they pulled away from the public eye. There was, however, a link, a line, that went from their past to this very moment in the present. There were more names on the piece of paper stuck to the wall than just two people who used to work in church. They stood for everything they had lost, everything they had worked for, and everything they had been through. Not even Suzy could miss how important this moment was. Just the thought of their names being back in that holy place made me feel like God was applauding them. It wasn't just happen. There was no chance about it. God was telling them that He still saw them, even though they had quit the church and the world had moved on. He was still working in their lives and had a plan for them. Suzy closed her eyes for a second and felt her feelings come over her. Everything else seemed to fade away as she focused on that small but powerful act of prayer. The weight of the past few years, the pain of being turned down, and the silence that had surrounded their exit from Daystar. Even though it wasn't loud or emotional, it was just what she needed. Even though they were in pain and uncertainty, it was a quiet sign that God was still with them, holding them and leading them. Suzy felt a deep peace settle into her heart at that very moment. I still have plans for you. This is not the end. You may have walked away from one chapter, but I am still writing your story. The tears that had been threatening to fall earlier now came freely, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of thanks. In this simple moment, this small prayer, she felt God's hand touch her and remind her of all they had been through and all that was still to come. It dawned on her that the moment wasn't just about her and Jonathan. It had to do with something bigger, a sign that the holy plan had been going on the whole time, even though they couldn't see it. It came at the right time when they needed it the most. It wasn't fancy. They couldn't have planned for it to happen. Nothing else could have made God show up that way. Rose had prayed for them in silence and without fail, and Suzy was moved to tears when she thought about her. An incredibly beautiful thing about how God works behind the scenes, planning important events that no one can see coming. Rose had no idea how bad what she had done was. This simple act made Suzy feel so much better, but she didn't know it. God did, and that was enough. Jonathan was just as moved when Suzy showed him the picture. The action itself wasn't what made it hurt. It made them feel like God was still with them, even though a lot of time had passed and things had changed. He didn't forget about them. It wasn't just them on this trip. As the days went by, Suzy thought more about what this divine moment really meant. It wasn't just a show of pride. It was a message that God was with them all the time, in all the seasons. It wasn't about the past, but about the promise of what was to come. He was writing a new story. This prayer and the quiet time at the Western Wall were signs from God that their story wasn't over. It was just getting started. Most people were shocked when Daystar quit, but for Jonathan and Suzy Lamb, it had been a long time coming. Outsiders saw their choice as hasty, but for them, it was the result of years of rising tension, spiritual conflict, and a deep disappointment. They weren't planning to go. They had no idea that one day they would leave a mission that had been such an important part of their lives. They were at a fork in the road, though, and what they chose would change everything. Jonathan had grown up in the gospel work. He was born with it. Marcus and Joni Lamb were the founders of Daystar, a worldwide Christian TV network that had a huge impact on their children. From a very young age, Jonathan was used to being around cameras, labs, and the busy world of ministry. He had grown up in the public eye, which he loved most of the time. He had faith in Daystar's purpose. He had faith in the work his parents were doing, the word they were spreading, and the difference they were making in the world. And when it was time for him to start working at Daystar, it seemed like the next step. This was his calling. This was what his family left behind. Things began to feel different over time, though. Something was different about the air, and Jonathan couldn't ignore it. It used to feel like a community where everyone was working together for a shared goal, but now it felt more like a machine that had to be controlled, maintained, and kept running at all costs. Jonathan had always been a man of strong beliefs, but he started to see that what Daystar stood for and how it worked behind the scenes were becoming more and more different. He began to think that things were not what they seemed to be. Small choices that didn't make sense were the first signs of trouble. There were talks that felt more like orders than discussions. More time went by, and Jonathan could see that Daystar's society was changing. There was less kindness and more stress. People worked together less and were in charge more. The worst part was that Jonathan felt even more alone the more he tried to speak up. It was getting dangerous to question and criticize how things were being run. His role as a leader with a voice had changed. Now he was seen as someone who was making waves. One bad day, Jonathan was given a prepared statement to read live on TV, and everything came to a head. That was a very positive review of his mother, Joni, and her recent marriage to Doug Weiss, which had already caused a lot of trouble in the Christian community. Jonathan was aware that he did not agree with this statement. It wasn't in his heart. He felt like he was being told to read from a script, a message that didn't show how he really felt. He knew that reading it would be lying to himself, God, and the people who would see it. So Jonathan did something that almost no one else in his situation would have done. No, he said. He wouldn't read the message. It was a small act of defiance, but the Daystar team was shocked by it. At the time, Jonathan didn't know how important that moment would turn out to be. Some people saw what he did as a simple act of personal belief as betrayal. He was very bold to question what was being said from the top. As the son of the founders, how could he refuse to publicly back his mother? Everything changed after that. The authorities stopped being friendly with him, where they used to be friendly. The help that he used to get started to go away. There was no talking or trying to see things from his point of view. He was met with silence instead. Soon after, with no warning or fuss, he and Suzy were both fired from their jobs at Daystar. What had been their life's work, and what had felt like family to them, had now turned its back on them. They were thrown out as if they had never been a part of the group the first place. It wasn't just losing their titles and position that was hard for Jonathan and Suzy. It was losing the friends and family they had made. Friends they had known for years. People they had prayed with and served with stopped calling them all of a sudden. Invitations to events stopped coming. People who used to be in their lives with them now steer clear of them. It wasn't just that they had left Daystar. The people felt like they were kicked out of the town that had been their home. It was impossible to hear anything. They seemed to have been erased from the office. Their years of service were gone in an instant. Even though being turned down was painful, the mental damage was even worse. Daystar was everything to Jonathan and Suzy. They gave everything they had to the church because they thought it was God's work. But all of that was gone in the blink of an eye. They had no idea what to do and felt very lost and confused. After that, they went through one of the worst times of their lives. There were whispers and rumors going around about them. People thought they had quit for personal reasons, because they didn't get along with the leaders, or because they just wanted to leave the church. The truth, though, was much messier. It wasn't their choice to leave Jonathan and Suzy. They didn't plan to leave the office. They were leaving a system that was no longer safe. They were leaving a place that didn't make them feel safe or like home anymore. However, Jonathan and Suzy knew they had made the right choice, even though it hurt. It wasn't easy to leave Daystar, but it had to be done. They had poured their hearts into the work for years, but they realized that they had forgotten about their own hearts in the process. They hadn't paid attention to the increasing tension and spiritual dissonance inside them. In order to keep the peace, they had set aside their own beliefs, and that peace cost something in the end. It wasn't just quitting a job or a mission. For them, it was about getting back their own sense of self and purpose. It was about going back to a peaceful place where they could hear God's words again, without being interrupted by responsibilities and stress. So they went away. They left their home in Texas and moved to Montana. Not to start a new mission, but just to stay alive, breathe, and get better. The trip was not fun at all, but it had to be done. The world was shocked when they quit Daystar, but it was the start of something new. A journey of healing, recovery, and rebuilding their faith in a way that wasn't limited by titles or platforms. The sudden end of their time at Daystar wasn't the end for Jonathan and Suzy. It was the start of something new. Before they got to Montana, Jonathan and Suzy Lamb had built a mission, relationships, and a life together at Daystar. But after everything fell apart, they found themselves there. It wasn't a very exciting place to go. They didn't have any big plans or mission opportunities lined up. It was a small town in the woods, far away from everything else. At first, they didn't even choose it. There was no need to start a new story or look for the next big thing. It was about finding peace, staying alive, and giving their souls the time and room they needed to heal. It was like going to a different world when I moved to Montana. There were no longer any cameras, bright lights, or a stage. There was no longer the stress of having to perform well or meet standards. There were no more due dates, calls that had to be answered, or public scrutiny. There was nothing there but space. The air was still, and they could feel the peace and quiet in their bones and hearts. At first it was hard. It was never that easy, but it was just what they needed. Things didn't go as planned when they moved to Montana. They didn't have any plans at all. They didn't come with a plan or a goal for what to do next. It wasn't like they came with big plans to start something new. They came to rest, breathe, and just be. Being in the public eye and working in a mission that required a lot of them for years made them want one thing: peace and quiet. It was important for them to take some time to sit and think about what had happened. They needed a break from all the noise in the world, and Montana gave them that. There was a huge sense of not knowing what to do during the first few weeks. It felt strange to have quiet mornings, long periods of silence, and not being able to talk to everyone all the time. Because Jonathan and Suzy had been in the fast-paced ministry for so many years, moving into stillness was both strange and healing. It didn't happen all at once or quickly, but over time, they realized how much this time they had needed it. Without the outside world to confuse them, they started to get back in touch with each other. They started to remember what it was like to be together as a couple, to share quiet times and talk about life, faith, and everything else without having to act or answer to anyone else. They found a small church nearby. Finally, they sat in the seats as people, not as leaders or speakers, for the first time in years. Not a single title or promise was given. They were not known as the Lambs from Daystar. Jonathan and Suzy were the only ones there. Both of them had been through a lot and were just looking for peace. The church didn't care what their last name was, or how long they had been in service. The way they were was fine with everyone. There were no big greetings or extra attention paid to certain people. They could be open and honest there, and they could rest in God's presence without worrying about being watched by others or being led by others. In that small, modest church, they started to see how beautiful it is to keep things simple again. Things that used to seem so hard to understand. Things like standards, leadership, and the need to always be on began to fade. For them, Montana was a place where life wasn't about how well they did. What they could give or do for other people wasn't important. It was only about being there. It was about being happy over little things. It's nice to go for long walks in the woods, have coffee in the morning, and watch the sun go down over the mountains at night. In a way they hadn't been able to in years, it was about getting back in touch with their family, their kids, and each other. But it wasn't just to get away from everything going on in the world. It was about getting better. They had deep scars from their time at Daystar. It was painful to feel rejected, betrayed, and forgotten by a mission they had given their lives to. It all left marks. Daystar was everything to Jonathan and Suzy. For the church, they had given up time, energy, and even their own health. And they weren't just leaving their jobs behind when they left. It was a way of life. They had been together for years and had grown close. They had trusted others and had a vision that seemed like a calling at one point. There were times when the sadness was too much to handle. Some nights they couldn't sleep because they couldn't figure out what went wrong or if they had made the right decision. It was hard. They couldn't just shake off the pain, but they started to feel at ease in Montana's peace. They learned that healing doesn't always happen in big ways or big events. Sometimes being still is what you need to heal. Small, everyday things that don't make the news or where it happens. There are times when important things happen that no one else sees. For it to happen, you have to be present, let go of the need to do something, and let God work in the background. They started to talk about their journey little by little, piece by piece, not in big, well-thought-out statements, but in honest, raw thoughts. They talked about what it meant to trust God even when things seemed to be going wrong.